Welcome to episode 46 of the New Quantum Era. I'm your host, Sebastian Hassinger. I'm at the 2025 APS Summit, and I want to thank the APS for providing the space for me to record. Today's episode actually was recorded before the summit, so just the week before because of scheduling challenges, but this intro is being recorded in the room that APS has kindly provided. I'm excited to bring you a conversation with someone familiar to longtime listeners, Steve Girvin, professor of physics at Yale University. Steve's been a key figure in the Yale Quantum Institute and has been at the forefront of quantum computing research for many years. He's been a key player in sort of creating that vibrant superconducting quantum computing community that's emerged from the university. He first joined us back on our fifth episode in 2022. And I'm really excited about this conversation. We got him to take us through sort of the ins and outs of quantum memories. So something that's not discussed as often as qubits for computation is storing of quantum memory. So if you think about RAM in a classical computer, it's where the work is stored in intermediate stage while the CPU is working on other bits of active memory, and it swaps it in and out of the working space and the storage space. And that is going to be required for fully functional quantum computers as well. So Steve does an incredible job, I think, of taking us through what exactly quantum memory is, what the design of that memory is going to entail, how it's going to be accessed, things like error correction, some of the roots, even going back to the beginnings of classical computing. So it's a really fascinating conversation. And this interview with Steve comes to you with support from Quantum Circuits, the New Haven-based company that was launched out of Yale and co-founded by one of Steve's colleagues, Rob Schulkoff, another key figure in superconducting qubits. Quantum Circuits is focused on delivering its full-stack Acumen system that attempts to correct errors first and then scale. So Quantum Circuits is leading the way in error detection built into its dual rail qubits. And let's dive in and hear the conversation with Steve. Enjoy. Welcome back, Steve.
Well, thank you, Sebastian. It's a pleasure to be back and usually have fun chatting with you.
Thank you.
Hope to again.
Same. Let's hope so. So I was hoping today, Steve, that we could talk about your work in quantum memories. It's a topic that doesn't come up as often in quantum computing because we're focused on, sort of numbers of qubits and fidelity of qubits and error corrected qubits and the computation part of the actual workhorses of quantum computing. But quantum memories, I remember going to QIP a few years ago and realizing that about at least half of the talks started with, well, assuming we have quantum memories, we'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. So it's a really critical part of an eventual sort of productive architecture. So what is quantum memory?
Good question. So let's start with the fact that most existing, there are many different technologies for realizing quantum bits, qubits, and generally they don't faithfully hold their information nearly as long as we need for them to do. They're quantum objects that consist of states that are superpositions of some ground state and some excited state, like in an atom or in a superconducting circuit. And things go wrong. The energy leaks off into the environment, or the frequency at which this thing, it turns out it's oscillating around because of quantum mechanics, fluctuates a little bit, and you lose track of a quantity which is not present in classical bits, the phase of the superposition. So you can have bit flips and a new kind of error called a phase flip. And so there's a lot of work just trying to get single bits to remember their job long enough that we can do computation, and so forth. But so that's one simple
Right.
answer.
So that would
And
be, I mean, essentially coherence time, right? That's sort of the
exactly,
generic
exactly,
way of, yeah, okay.
exactly. And there's a fundamental theorem of quantum computer science. There's no such thing as too much coherence.
No, yeah.
If we make it 100 times longer, the algorithm people are going to say, "Great, I want to run a program 1,000 times
Right,
longer."
right, right.
There is no limit.
I guess the corollary to that is the universe does not want to give us more coherence time either.
Right. It's not, yeah, it seems to be uh, like a law of thermodynamics, that the first law is the best you can do is break even. The second law is you can't break even. uh, but then there's a more interesting, I don't know whether to call them data structures or memory architectures, but let's remember that in like a classical processor, traditional processor, you have cache memory and you have RAM and you have in my day we had tape and so forth. But there are different speeds of access of these things.
And timescales, and I mean,
The
there's
timescales, yeah,
far more random access memory space in a classical CPU than there is actual working space, right? It's sort of temporary storage, or
exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly, yeah. And it's possible to make cache memory you can access very quickly, but not in terabyte scales that we use. So you need slower but bigger memory. So there's that kind of architecture and all the crazy things you have to do to keep track of, are my bits in cache or are they over here? All that stuff, which I can't imagine how it works, but people have figured out how to make it work.
Well, it's easier in that you can measure a bit without destroying it.
Exactly,
They have that
exactly,
advantage.
exactly. Qubits are a little trickier in that
Yes.
regard. So, but there is this interesting structure called a QRAM, a quantum random access memory, which I'll attempt to describe. It would be easier if I could show pictures, but I'll try to describe this in an audio only format. Um, and what is this good for? Well, it doesn't exist yet. Let me explain that. Nobody's actually built one yet. We and others are working on it. Um, and it's a not well advertised or often swept under the rug feature that if you want to do anything with big data in a quantum computer, you need a way to get all the classical data uh, encoded into some quantum state inside the quantum computer if you're going to do calculations on it. So people talk about quantum enhanced machine learning and various kind of big data tasks, and those will, given that, and you can do this with quantum random access memory, but since they don't exist yet, not even crude ones. We don't even have ones that don't work yet. We just don't. We don't have any.
Right. We have
Uh,
qubits that don't work, but we don't have
right.
quantum RAM that doesn't work.
Exactly. Exactly. So I believe that as we build larger and larger and more fault tolerant quantum computers, we'll be able to do interesting things, but things involving big data will be the last thing that we succeed in doing. Okay, so that's my giant caveat at the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah, yeah. Well, and
Uh,
I think it's worth pointing out, when you say big data, you mean literally anything larger than the number of qubits that we physically have in a device, right? I mean,
so, in fact, that's right. So, as I'm going to explain, obviously, a classical memory has to have as many memory cells as data you want to put in there. And the same is true in uh, quantum random access memory, you actually need maybe about twice as many because of something I'll explain. But and we don't have exponentially large numbers of qubits. And if we did, they wouldn't work very well enough to treat exponentially large problems. But so let's talk about how you define how big is the size of the situation here. Let's say we have a memory, whether it's classical or quantum, and it has it. The data lives at an address, and there are n bits in the address. Then you can have 2 to the n different locations. Okay. So we'll say the size of the memory and the size of problems we're addressing is exponential in the number of address bits. Okay, so if I had, 20-bit address, that would be about 1 million sites. That's not very big by classical standards, but it's enormous by I don't think the world has built 1 million qubits yet. So
Probably not.
Okay. So just so everybody's starting with the simple story. How does or how shall we pretend that a classical ordinary RAM works? You give it your address strings, and it goes and fetches the data at that address and puts it into a register, and then
where you can actually work on it.
You can work on it. You can see what it is. Okay. So we're gonna put quantum. We're gonna start with classical data. Some database, a phone book, or something, and we're gonna put the data into a quantum register associated that, you give it an address and it gives you back a quantum register that has the data in it. So far it's exactly the same. But there's this weird superposition principle. Now imagine that I send to the memory a quantum state, which is a giant superposition of all possible addresses I could give it.
Right.
And then what comes back is entangled with each address is the data associated with that address.
Right.
Okay, so if your head isn't hurting yet.
Of course. That's why I do this podcast, because I really want my head to hurt all the time.
You missed the memo somewhere.
Yeah.
But, So this is an amazing, complicated, entangled state, which in itself is pretty interesting from a scientific point of view. But you've now encoded all this classical data, which was kind of the quantum random access memory fetched from some classical register and put it into this quantum register. It's all in there all at once, the whole database, even though it's sitting in like one register or 2 registers, one for the address and one for the data. And you don't know which address it is, but you know that the data that goes with that address is in the other register. So if you were to measure what's in there, it would randomly collapse to one address and the associated data. But that's kind of useless because it doesn't offer any quantum advantage. So somehow you have to have this entangled quantum state. And there are algorithms. People have thought about classification of large data with machine learning methods and so on and on, which suppose you want to do linear algebra, solve some equations on giant matrices whose entries were you looked up from the classical data, something like that. You need this resource in order to execute these algorithms that people have figured out. And Scott Aronson calls this the fine print, that getting this exponentially large amount of data into your quantum system, sometimes people don't put that in very fine
Yes,
print.
they hand wave past it. Yes.
Exactly. Okay.
And this
So
also just
yeah.
generically, this would be like state preparation is sort of generically
So
what that.
let's talk about what you can do with this. So you can take classical data and put it into a quantum state. So you could have a quantum state. I want to produce a certain quantum state because somebody told me it represents the ground state of some big molecule, what all the electrons are doing, or you want to prepare this state because you need it as the input to running some algorithm, or you want to the important thing about the state is that it has all the numbers for some linear algebra problem you want to solve. Okay. State preparation is one thing. Another thing is um, uh, construction of oracles. So black boxes which sort of compute a function.
Right. This is, I
And
mean, all the way in quantum algorithms goes all the way back to Deutsch Josha, right? I mean, that's a black box function. Yeah.
yeah. So you could think of I said, oh, you put in an address, you get back some data, but you could say, oh, the address is, X, and I want to know the value of the function f of X.
Right.
And that's stored as data at location X, and I bring it back. So basically oracles evaluate function that takes a binary input and gives you some binary output. And that's like that's what all classical algorithms do. You give them an input, it gives you some output that's a function of that. So that's a very powerful general thing that many quantum algorithms use. Okay, good. So there's a bunch of things like that where where this QRAM, it's just a RAM that works in superposition, or it's a function evaluator. It's a way of taking stuff that's encoded classically and letting your quantum computer use it. Okay. So how what's the architecture of these things? What do they look like? Well, so it looks kind of like an upside down tree. It's a binary tree. The root is at the top, and then imagine driving down the road and you come to a fork in the road, and as my friend Shankar says, because it's quantum mechanics, you take it.
Yeah.
But let's just think classically for a minute. I choose to go left or right instead of both. And then I make another decision, left or right, and I branch into smaller and smaller branches. And at the very bottom of this upside down tree, or this funny road network, are the leaves where the classical data is waiting to be picked up and returned. So you have to have n branches in the tree so that you end up with 2 to the
right.
n forks in any root, so you get 2 to the n leaves you could end up on. So so at the first level you have you need a router that somehow decides where to send things. There's one router, then 2 routers, then 4 routers, then 8 routers. Pretty soon you've got a lot of routers.
Yeah. I remember the story about the chessboard and the Great
Exactly.
Surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, that made a big impact on me when I was a kid.
It's a good one.
Isaac Asimov, 1, 2, 3 Infinity is where I first read that. Okay, so what I need to do is somehow, given the address, I kind of need to route a quantum bit down through this tree to the place where it can pick up the correct classical data. Let's say it's It's returning only one qubit just to keep it simple. So we're thinking hard about how to build these routers, and then then there's this complicated thing, like how do you tell the routers what the address is so they know which way to route you?
Right.
And without going into details, there's this cool version of this called bucket brigade, which is actually how classical memory works, where you send in the address bits, and the most significant bit stays at the top, and then you use that to route the next most significant bit, and then use those two to route the third most significant. And eventually it kind of lights up a path down through the tree that guides your extra qubit to go down and pick up the classical data. So this is doable. It's a very challenging problem because you have to route quantum data using a quantum decision about whether to go left or right, meaning you have to go both left and right if it's in superposition. So it's quantum routing of quantum data. And that's, we sort of have demonstrated some of the right technology, but we haven't put it together yet into a useful QRAM. Superconducting qubit, people are thinking about it. Rydberg atom, people are thinking about it. And we'll be able to do small demonstrations soon, but building a gigabit QRAM is a ways off.
So, and the approach you've been taking, I think, at Yale has primarily been in sort of the upper energy levels of a superconducting qubit, right? Like the Q-trit space.
So we have some options. So we have these transmon qubits that were developed here at Yale, and they're like many things we call qubits. They actually have more than two levels, and if you use the first three levels, you have a Q-trit, and these routers need to, or in one version of the architecture, the routers need three states, idle, or route left, or route right.
Right. Okay.
Wait state, I guess. So it's called W, R, and L. Wait, right, and left. And you could do that with three levels. You can actually do it with two levels. It's a little bit simpler in some ways, but so that's one quantum object you could use. We've done some work recently with my former postdoc, Danny Weiss. When I say we, I mean Danny. Danny did this quite nice work where the qubit is what we call a dual resonator, or in the optics language, dual rail qubit, where you have two boxes, and there's a microwave photon, one total microwave photon. It's either in the left box or the right box or a superposition. Those are the qubit states. And there's some advantages for using those because it's easy to move microwave photons down through a tree structure like this using what we call beam splitters. And the fidelity with which we can do that is quite good. 3 nines for each hop. So after 10 hops, it's still 99% fidelity. He came up with.
So sorry, would each hop then relate to one of your branch in the trees? So
exactly.
You'd have 2 to the 10 sort of register space at the end of 10. Okay, great. That's not bad. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. And it's interesting that some earlier work, which was pioneered by Connor Hahn when he was a student here with Liang Zhang, looked at the error situation. Like we have X, if we have N bits of address, we have exponentially many qubits and routers and all these components, all of which are having errors. And so if you had, at the bottom of the tree, there were a million leaves, and the probability of an error was, 1 in 1,000, then on average, you'd have 1,000 errors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it sounds hopeless. You could never do this. But he showed that because this is for tricky reasons, it's called a shallow circuit. The depth is only equal to the number of address bits, so the depth is only 10. And if you think about any one path down through the tree to its intended address, that's just one out of a million. And chances are that there's only roughly one chance in 1,000 that that particular path has the error. So it turns out the error situation is much less drastic. It's like one of the few times in my life when it wasn't the worst case scenario. It turned out
Right.
better than
I,
we
I
expected.
do think that working in the space that you're working in requires a very thick skin to worst case scenarios, right?
Yeah, exactly. So people were in a panic about this, but Connor's work and some other earlier work showed that it's actually it's not fatal. Let's put it that way.
And would there be a way potentially to do error correction in that quantum memory space? I mean,
Yes, it's expensive because it was already expensive to get a million qubits. Now you need a million logical qubits, and you need sort of routers which are somehow fault tolerant and so forth. So it's, people are starting to think about this, but um, it's um, it's going to be complicated and
yeah.
expensive.
Well, and going back to what you said about coherence time, you've done some work in three-dimensional cavities showing coherence of up to like a second, I think, right? I mean, like really, really
Well,
long.
we haven't. I mean, the 1 second cavity work was done at Fermilab,
Okay.
and then we've done sort of a half to 10 milliseconds at Yale, and then one of Rob Sholkoff's um, one of our alumni from Rob's group. Uh, in Israel has Serge Rosenblum has
Hmm.
built a really nice 35 millisecond lifetime cavity that has a qubit in it, and he can control it and probably holds the world record for largest Schrodinger cat state, which has 1,024 photons in it. Amazing.
Wow. So does that does the I guess my question is like, does expanding the coherence time improve sort of the outlook for quantum memory?
Yes. Even at the single qubit level, one dual resonator, dual rail qubit, if those cavities have 10 millisecond lifetime instead of 1 millisecond lifetime, that's a huge advantage. And as I said, if you assemble millions of these together, now instead of having 1,000 errors, you might have only 100 errors. And in any case, that's out of a million possible places the errors can happen. If there's only 100 of them that are bad, the fidelity is actually still quite good by this funny argument that we came to understand.
That's interesting. I mean, is it safe to say that the fact that Quantum Circuits Incorporated and Alice and Bob and Nord Quantique, there's a number of new sort of entrants in the superconducting space that are preparing to or are launching sort of commercially available devices that are using these alternative superconducting qubit designs that you've mentioned, like cat qubits and dual rail,
Right.
that may sort of be a step towards, I mean, at least providing the materials, resources for people to do more experimentation in quantum memories?
Yes, I think there's a sort of threshold theorem that if you get the error rate low enough, then building larger and larger error correcting codes will make things better and better instead of worse and worse. And so the hope is that by devoting some effort at the very lowest level of the hardware, the individual qubits, getting their lifetimes and their gate fidelities higher and higher, so that you're way below this error threshold, then the rate at which the memory lifetime grows as you make the code larger and larger is very, very fast. If you're just barely below the threshold, it's barely growing. And we sort of feel the right way around to do things is to get well below threshold and then scale up. That's sort of our mantra. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really is fascinating to me how this superconducting qubit is evolving into these alternative, sort of more challenging, I think, mechanical designs, right? Electronic designs,
Yes.
harder to fabricate, but the end result is a higher quality qubit.
Yeah, that's right. And some of them, like the 3D cavities, are physically large, sort of centimeter scale. And we get a
Really,
lot
that
of,
large, one
yeah,
centimeter. Wow.
yeah. But you can make 2D versions of this with micro machining that make the total volume much smaller. And, as I may have said the last time I was on here, Rob Shulkoff likes to say, in a cubic meter fridge, there's a million cubic centimeters, and it would be a quality problem to run out of
Yes.
qubits at that level. So,
Indeed.
yeah.
Indeed.
Uh,
May
and
we get to that problem in our
exactly,
lifetimes.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, so this is it's an interesting, people talk about the full stack, from the hardware and the controller and the compiler and all the way up to applications. And we need an interdisciplinary work at every level of that stack to get this thing uh, working. And just think about the investment that's been made in the classical software stack. I mean,
Absolutely.
when I started the first time I saw, okay, cathode ray tube, do people even a screen? Let me just call it a
Yeah.
screen. And you could edit instead of making a new punch card. I
Right.
thought, wow,
Yeah.
I have reached
Well,
nirvana.
and going even further back, right? I mean, this is why I'm constantly in conversations with you and others who are at this sort of, at the limits of these designing and trying to build these architectures. I think about uh, von Neumann and Princeton IAS, right? And
Yeah.
using cathode ray tubes as RAM, as the first classical
Yes.
memories.
Yes.
And the there was a mercury switch too that they were using to sort of
Yeah,
at
they had
delay
these
memory.
long tubes of
Right.
mercury, which wouldn't be allowed today,
Yeah.
and they would launch a sound wave in one end, and it would come out the other end like a millisecond later, and then they would have to send it back to the beginning and keep it going around and around with a little amplifier to store it for more than a millisecond. And this was a big deal in those
Yes,
days.
exactly, exactly. So, I mean, it seems like impossible challenge on top of impossible challenge, but that's probably how von Neumann and the rest of the crew at Princeton felt too.
Absolutely. And some of the early concepts of fault tolerance in networks of switches and computer networks were invented by von Neumann in that era. He was partly inspired by the fact that the thing would only run for a few minutes before one of the vacuum tubes would go out. But he was also interested in how the human brain, is just some random wiring of neurons with feed forward and feedback, and how that could reliably compute. And a
It's a good
lot of,
question.
yeah, and maybe it
Can it
can't.
reliably
Maybe
compute?
exactly. But,
We'll find out.
those ideas of classical fault tolerance play a big role, mutatis mutandis, in the quantum uh, drive to achieve fault tolerance, repetition codes, all those things. So, we're still building on, we're still benefiting from those early crude experiments.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, once again, Steve, an excellent conversation. Thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable and a fascinating look into yet another impossible challenge in quantum computing. So
Right.
thank
I
you.
mean, we can only hope that future generations will look back and say, boy, that must have been hard back in
Yeah,
2025, but look how far we've come.
exactly.
We can hope for
Awesome.
that.
We can.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you
it's a
so much.
pleasure. Thank you very much. Yep.
That's it for another episode of the podcast. Thanks for joining. I want to thank Steve Girvin for a delightful conversation. I want to thank the support of APS and Quantum Circuits. You can find past episodes on the web at www.newquantumera.com. You can find us on Blue Sky at newquantumera.com. If you have any feedback, Blue Sky is the best place to do it. You can just reply to the episode that you are commenting on, and we'll see it and we'll definitely respond. So any feedback, any suggestions of future guests, future topics, all are welcome. The podcast is a production of New Quantum Era, and music by Omar Costa Hamido, and your host, Sebastian Hassinger. Thanking you, and see you next time.